Coffee, coffee, coffee. Most people have coffee with every meal, sometimes even multiple times a day, and I know some people that have coffee at night as well. And this shows in the overall global market with a total market size of $127 billion in 2022 and a very modest growth rate of 4.72% in the next 7 years. Most of us don't think a lot about getting coffee from the grocery store to our tables. We don't really think about how the coffee gets there in the first place. But what if I told you we should be thinking about that? And what if I also told you that there's perhaps a multi-billion-dollar industry of exploitation, corruption, and unfair treatment behind your simple cup of coffee in the morning? To understand this better, we need to take a step back, and no, I don't blame you for what I'm about to talk about. The history and roots of coffee, particularly in Latin America, run very, very deep. Coffee was introduced in Latin America in the 18th century, brought by European colonizers who saw its commercial potential. The Spanish, Portuguese, and particularly French played a significant role in establishing coffee cultivation across the region. One of the earliest records of coffee cultivation in Latin America dates back to the early 1700s. In the Caribbean, the French introduced coffee to Martinique in 1720, and from there it spread to other territories as well. And by the mid-18th century, coffee plantations were established in areas like Brazil, which would later become the world's greatest coffee producer. The Brazilian boom began around the 19th century, with coffee exports driving the entire nation's economy. By 1850, Brazil was supplying 40% of the world's coffee, a figure that would grow to 80% by the 1920s. Now here we particularly need to pay attention, and this is important for the future, to the concept of coffee plantations. In Latin America, they were built on a system of large estates, or often called haciendas, excuse my pronunciation, owned by wealthy European landowners or colonizers. These estates were worked by indigenous people, also enslaved Africans, and later poor local laborers. The key point to note here is that the land distribution was highly unequal. Land ownership was concentrated among a small elite, leading to a significant socioeconomic disparity that persists in many regions today, the foundations of which were laid by these colonizers. In Guatemala, for example, over 70% of the arable land was controlled by 2% of the population by the early 20th century, much of it dedicated to export coffee. To add on to this unequal distribution of land, you also had the problem of cheap labor, and this was met through complete exploitation. Enslaved Africans were used in countries like Brazil until the abolition of slavery in 1888, and indigenous communities in places like Guatemala and Mexico were forced into labor through coercive laws and debt systems. And since a large part of land in these countries was actually used for coffee cultivation, by the late 19th and early 20th century, countries like Colombia, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Honduras became heavily dependent on coffee exports. In Colombia, for example, coffee accounted for 55% of the nation's export revenue by the 1930s. And what's more is that the entire infrastructure of some countries was built around the coffee industry. For example, railroads and ports were often built primarily to support coffee exportation. This did help modernize these countries, but it also meant that economic development was focused disproportionately on the export sector, often at the expense of domestic needs. And once again, this is where the bigger problem lies: the dependency on coffee, which leads to a very harsh reality for coffee farmers. Coffee, in fact, is one of the most traded commodities in the world, with millions of farmers relying on it as their primary source of income. However, the earnings for these farmers are often shockingly low, despite the retail prices of coffee in stores and cafes. So even though the coffee industry is worth around $130 billion worldwide, most coffee farmers even today earn less than $2 a day, despite the industry also seeing a significant growth rate in the future. And what adds on to this is that global coffee prices are notoriously volatile, often subject to supply and demand fluctuations that have little to do with the realities of farmers on the ground. The price of coffee on the world market can be affected by various factors, including climate conditions, maybe crop diseases, and even sometimes international trade policies. For instance, the price of coffee in 2018 fell to its lowest in over a decade, dropping dipping below $1 per pound. In contrast, a cup of coffee in a cafe can cost anywhere from $2 to $6, and I would argue it's even higher than $6 in recent years, especially in America, Canada, and the Western world. This massive discrepancy highlights how little farmers can earn, even though the profits made by large coffee companies continue to keep on increasing. To summarize this in one statistic, the International Coffee Organization found that the price of coffee has been below the cost of production for many small-scale farmers for years, leaving them unable to break even. In fact, in some regions, farmers are forced to sell their beans for as little as 60 cents per pound, which is below the cost of production. And because of this volatility, there's also many middlemen in coffee. The coffee supply chain is long and complex. There's numerous middlemen involved before the beans reach consumers. Small-scale farmers, just because they don't have the means to reach the end consumer, often sell their coffee to intermediaries, who then sell it to exporters, roasters, or large coffee corporations. These middlemen typically take a significant cut of the profits, leaving farmers with a fraction of the price consumers pay for coffee. We can take large coffee corporations as an example, for example, Starbucks, Nestle, and JAB Holdings, which own brands like Dunkin' and Peet's Coffee, that purchase coffee at prices that are often set through international trading systems and global commodity exchanges, where the focus is on maximizing profits for multinational corporations instead of ensuring fair wages for farmers. And if you know anything about Starbucks, and not just Starbucks, other corporations as well, they control branding and marketing for their companies, allowing them to profit handsomely from coffee culture. While the farmers who grow the beans rarely see any of the profits, even premium coffee brands such as specialty and single origin coffee often fail to ensure a fair wage for farmers in the supply chain. A lot of people think that fair trade or other corporations that were created to address these inequalities by ensuring that farmers earn a higher wage solve the problem, but that's simply not the case. There's systemic issues that these programs do not address. Even though farmers do end up making marginally more money, the difference is not really meaningful for most farmers. So much so that even with fair trade, according to the World Bank, the average income of a coffee farmer in Latin America is often below the poverty line. Many coffee farmers struggle to make ends meet, earning less than $2 a day. This financial instability means that farmers have little to invest in improving their operations, maybe diversifying, and getting other income sources. What's more is that even programs like the Fair Trade Program do not provide farmers the security they need in off-season. Coffee farming is seasonal, and during off-season periods, many farmers have no other means of generating income. This creates an environment where families are forced to live paycheck to paycheck, struggling to afford food, healthcare, or even basic tools and equipment. And since most of these countries do not have proper credit or financing systems, this also limits farmers' ability to invest in their farms, meaning that they rely on outdated and inefficient farming techniques, leading to lower yields and quality. Furthermore, and a less talked about aspect is the gender inequality and its impact on women farmers. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash the like button and the subscribe button. Every subscriber helps get this video to the right people who are interested in learning of stories and topics that affect all of us on a daily basis. In many Latin American countries, women often participate in the agricultural economy and are often marginalized. Even though they play a crucial role in coffee production, they don't have the same resources, training, or even land ownership as their male counterparts. So much so that, according to the International Fund for Agriculture Development, or the IFAD, women coffee farmers earn as little as 20% less than their male counterparts in the same exact regions. So now you have a situation where coffee farmers are not earning enough and women are earning even less. What does that do to community dynamics? Well, the first thing is that it massively impacts children. According to the International Labor Organization, child labor is a significant issue in coffee growing regions, and many children working on coffee farms from a young age often skip school and, in fact, sometimes do not even attend it at all. These children miss out on critical education, which also limits their future prospects and perpetuates the cycle of poverty that exists in these communities. And even from a business perspective, if your children and you are not able to get educated, you don't get the training and the resources you need to improve your farming techniques or diversify your income. Due to the pressures of being a coffee farmer, there's also a significant burden on healthcare. Coffee farmers often live in remote areas with limited access to medical services. This leaves them vulnerable to disease and injury. The prevalence of malnutrition, inadequate maternal care, and high infant mortality rates is also common in coffee growing regions. In Guatemala, for example, maternal mortality rates are significantly higher than the national average in coffee growing regions, exacerbated by poverty and limited access to healthcare facilities. And this lifestyle of stress with inadequate healthcare also leads to an issue of mass migration. Economic hardship often drives families to migrate in search of better opportunities. In some cases, entire communities are forced to leave their rural areas and move to urban centers or even other countries in hopes of finding work. Migration is particularly prevalent in countries like El Salvador and Nicaragua, where families are seeking better living conditions or escaping violence and instability related to poverty. So now we understand more about why coffee farmers are at a disadvantage because they produce coffee in the first place. But what about the world and the environment in general? Traditional coffee farming methods, particularly in large-scale monoculture plantations, have significant environmental consequences. Coffee is often grown in vast, uniform plots of land with little regard for biodiversity or even soil health. This intensive farming approach depletes the soil of essential nutrients, leading to soil degradation, erosion, and lower yields over time. Because of high demand, the lack of crop rotation means that the soil is constantly exposed to the same methods, resulting in a depletion of vital minerals such as nitrogen and phosphorus. Without adequate soil management, these farms require heavy chemical inputs such as synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. These chemicals further contaminate local water and harm surrounding ecosystems. Not just the farms, but the initial clearing of land for coffee production is especially problematic in tropical regions. Trees are cut down to make way for coffee plantations, reducing the natural habitats of countless species. You can see this all across the world. In Brazil, for example, the world's largest coffee producer, there's severe degradation due to the expansion of coffee plantations. Coffee production in Brazil has been linked to the destruction of the Cerrado biome, which is home to a unique array of species, many of which are endangered. The conversion of forested lands into coffee plantations is causing the destruction of vital ecosystems and also increasing greenhouse gas emissions. We don't even have to go towards Latin America to see this. In Vietnam, which is of course not in Latin America, is also a big producer of coffee, largely through industrial coffee farming methods that have led to deforestation in the Central Highlands. The rapid expansion of coffee plantations in these areas has put pressure on local ecosystems, including endangered species like the yellow-cheeked gibbon. And if you don't care about the environment, that's fine, but if you love coffee, you might want this production to slow down, because a 2019 study by the International Coffee Organization warned that climate change could render more than 50% of the land currently suitable for coffee cultivation in Central America unsuitable by 2050 because of increasing temperatures and drought. This could severely reduce coffee production, causing supply shortages and further driving up coffee price. Adding on to this, unpredictable rainfall patterns caused by climate change have also led to periods of drought, followed by intense rains. These conditions contribute to crop diseases such as coffee leaf rust, a fungus that thrives in warmer and wetter conditions and causes havoc in farms throughout Latin America. Some countries are already facing the consequences. In Honduras, for example, it's estimated that over 90% of the country's natural forests have been cleared for agriculture purposes, with coffee being a major contributor. The deforestation of highlands in Guatemala, where coffee is a key export, has led to severe water shortages and soil erosion, threatening the long-term viability of coffee farming in these regions. At this point, we understand the consequences for the farmer and the environment, but what is the role of the coffee industry in this? Of course, one side is Starbucks and coffee purchasers like we talked about, but the other side is commodity exchanges, such as the New York Coffee Exchange and London International Financial Futures and Options Exchange. The prices listed on these exchanges are subject to fluctuations based on supply and demand, which often have little to do with the actual cost of production in coffee growing regions. And these exchanges are used by major companies, often through large importers or middlemen who act as intermediaries between farmers and coffee brands. These middlemen often dictate the prices that farmers receive, further diminishing their profits. But this is where a newer and more interesting part of the coffee industry comes in: certifications. For example, fair trade. This was established with the goal of promoting better wages, safer working conditions, and environmentally sustainable practices in coffee farming. It is the most well-known certification in the coffee industry and has been lauded for helping improve the livelihoods of small-scale farmers. Fair trade in particular guarantees farmers a minimum price for their coffee, ensuring that they're paid a baseline amount even when market prices are dropping. Additionally, farmers who are part of a fair trade certified cooperative receive a premium for their coffee, which can be reinvested in community projects like school, healthcare, or improved farming equipment. However, fair trade has received a lot of criticism for not always benefiting the intended recipients. The certification production process for one is often complex and costly, and many small farmers cannot afford the fees associated with the certification. Moreover, fair trade's impact on income is limited, as the price premiums and premium prices offered may still not be enough to cover the cost of sustainable farming practices, let alone lift farmers out of poverty. Additionally, fair trade has been criticized for not addressing the root causes of economic inequality in the coffee industry. For example, the dominance of large corporations and the global price fluctuations of coffee that we've already talked about. The premiums that farmers receive through fair trade are often seen as a short-term solution rather than a long-term structural change. Critics argue that primarily this does not challenge the power dynamics between farmers and multinational corporations, which continue to dictate prices. In response to this, other certifications like Rainforest Alliance and UTZ Certified have emerged, offering a different focus on environmental sustainability and social responsibility. However, again, like with fair trade, these programs have been critiqued for not always creating significant changes at the ground level for farmers. For example, Rainforest Alliance aims to protect biodiversity and improve environmental practices, but does not always guarantee better wages or conditions for the workers. But this is where consumers, i.e. you and me, because I also drink coffee, come in. Consumers are powerful, especially if they adopt certain values. For example, buying fair trade certified or another certification certified coffee might in some part guarantee that the farmers that you're actually buying from indirectly get a larger percentage of your money. And a lot of coffee roasters, for example, Stumptown Coffee Roasters, Equal Exchange, and others are also focusing on these relationships, particularly direct trade relationships. Direct trade is a movement gaining momentum where roasters and buyers work directly with the farmers, bypassing middlemen to ensure that farmers receive a fair price for their coffee. This model creates a closer relationship between producers and consumers, and more importantly, provides transparency, allowing for higher prices that better reflect the cost of production. A famous example is Cafe San Juan in Nicaragua. By working directly with roasters and cutting out middlemen, this cooperative has been able to secure better prices for its coffee, which has improved the economic stability for over 300 farmers in the region. And working in direct trade or with fair trade certified or other certification certified farmers statistically does prove to give them higher wages, with Fair Trade International claiming that farmers who are part of certified programs earn up to 30% higher wages than non-certified farmers. Furthermore, 95% of fair trade premiums are reinvested into farmer communities in the form of infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Another shift is also to support local and small-scale coffee producers. In addition to certifications, consumers can support these local producers. Many independent roasters and coffee shops prioritize sourcing directly from farmers now. For example, Coffee Kids, Sustainable Harvest, and the Coffee Trust work to connect consumers directly with coffee farmers, providing a direct link between the people who grow the coffee and people who consume it. And not just from the consumer end, there's also a shift from the production end. Agroforestry and shade-grown coffee has seen a rise in prominence. This farming technique involves cultivating coffee under a canopy of trees, which mimics the natural forest environment and promotes biodiversity. Farmers also benefit from agroforestry by growing multiple crops such as fruit trees, nuts, or timber, diversifying their income streams and making their farms more resilient to climate change. In Costa Rica, for example, farmers who employ shade-grown techniques have seen higher yields and better quality beans, while maintaining a healthier environment. Studies show that shade-grown coffee farms have up to 50% greater biodiversity. Also, coupling with this, organic coffee farming is seeing some momentum as well. This eliminates the use of synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. In Mexico, for example, organic coffee farming has grown significantly, with over 80,000 farmers certified under the USDA organic label. And to tie all of this up, water-efficient farming is also seeing interesting momentum. Coffee production can be water-intensive, especially in regions like Brazil and Honduras. Water-efficient practices are being adopted to reduce the strain on local water sources, such as using rainwater harvesting systems, efficient irrigation techniques, and wet processing methods. A famous example is in Peru. Farmers are turning to drip irrigation, which delivers water directly to the plant's roots, reducing evaporation and runoff. So things are improving from a consumer and producer perspective. perspective. But since a significant portion of the population consumes coffee every day, it's good to think about the business of coffee and the choices we make when it comes to purchasing our coffee. Of course, having coffee is not evil, but if you can afford to spare a couple minutes to think about who's actually getting your money when you buy coffee, it could in fact mean you're getting your money to the people who actually deserve it. The people spending hours in the heat cultivating that perfect coffee bean that gets you up and actually makes you feel excited for your day. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.